And we're live. Hello, book lovers. Welcome to the 108th episode of Authors Love Bookstores, presented by Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Kimberly Hensle Lowrance. For the past 2 years, I have virtually traveled across the United States, Canada, and Great Britain with my partner, Joe Moldover, to support independent bookstores and the authors who love them. To be fair, I've never met an author who doesn't love an independent bookstore, but we specifically shine a light on them. And we do this by talking about storytelling and creativity, and of course, these essential small businesses that enrich and build our communities. We're so grateful that you decided to spend some time with us today. And let me now introduce our guests for today's 108th episode. So I'm very pleased to welcome author Neema Avashia. Oh, see, Neema, I practiced and then I got so nervous.
Neema Avashia.
Yep. I apologize.
No
and
worries.
Our audience knows I practice and then I get nervous and I mess it up. So I appreciate your grace and your flexibility. So Neema is here with us today, and we're also joined by our bookseller, Mandy Fugit-Scheffel. Welcome to both of you. Okay, so we got over my embarrassing faux pas. Everything else will be smooth sailing. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about our guests. Neema was born and raised in West Virginia to parents who immigrated to the United States from India in the 1970s. She's a prolific writer and has been published in the Kenyon Review, The Bitter Southerner, Catapult, WBUR's Cognoscenti, and many other publications. Her first book we have here, and I have in my hands, which is Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, and it was published by West Virginia University Press in March. In addition to her writing, as if that's not enough, Neema is also a full-time civics and history teacher in the Boston Public Schools. And you focus on middle schools, am I right?
Yes.
This is like, people who teach middle schoolers, you're a special breed of sainthood all wrapped up into one person. No, you don't agree?
You either love it or you hate it. I think it's not a lukewarm space, adolescence, but personally, I love adolescence. I think it's a really wonderful time to be with young people because they're just really figuring out who they are. But a lot of people do not enjoy it. So,
well,
send me your teenagers. I'll take them.
Oh, I have two. We can have a conversation afterward. Okay, so Mandy is the owner of Red Spotted Newt, a bookstore which was founded in Hazard, Kentucky in 2020. And so Mandy, I love the origin story for the bookstore, and I want to talk about that. But on your website, you say that you spent a week at the Appalachian Writers Workshop in the summer of 2019. And that experience was just like, I want to replicate this at home. And that was your inspiration for opening the bookstore. Yes, which is amazing. And now readers and writers have a place to call home in your bookstore in Eastern Kentucky. So we're excited to hear more about your bookstore and Neema's work. So thank you so much for being with us today. Okay, so to our audience, if you have questions for Neema or Mandy, please feel to post them below the broadcast in the comments, and we'll get to as many as we can later on. Okay, so Neema, tell us about your connection to this bookstore. When we talked about being on the show. I know this is a bookstore that you felt very passionately about. So tell us about how you came to know Mandy and her store and why it's so special.
Sure. So Mandy and I share a space in common that we both have really strong feelings about, which is the Appalachian Writers Workshop at Heinemann Settlement School. She and I think, both have experienced that as a place that's been pretty transformative for us in terms of our writing and in terms of also being part of a community of readers and writers who really ground themselves in Appalachian identity. The bookstore opened and it was the pandemic, and I didn't go to Appalachia for a year and a half, almost 2 years. So I was sort of like watching the story of the Newt, right? And I was watching people start to go there. I was reading about what was happening, but it was kind of this place where I was like, I really need to get there. I really want to be there. And I'm watching it from a distance. And so it wasn't until this past June that I actually got to go down to Heinemann. I taught at their new Ironwood Writers Studio, which is a young writers workshop that they just started. for teenagers, my favorite people. And so I did a week of teaching nonfiction and fiction to young Appalachian writers. And then while I was down there, I got to do a reading at the Newt. And it sort of validated everything I'd already thought just based on sort of seeing from a distance. Being in that space really confirmed that Mandy's created like a really powerful and important space in Hazard, Kentucky. And I just keep thinking about the word haven. Like that's the word that comes up for me again and again because we're in Hazard, Kentucky in a not large bookstore. And the number of queer people in that room, I would say at least half of the people in the room were queer folks who go there knowing that that is a space where you're going to be able to find books that reflect your identity, where you're going to find people who care about you and support you and welcome you as who you are. And I think that speaks to a thing about independent bookstores that I'm not sure people totally always realize, which is they're not just places that sell books, they're centers of community. And they're spaces that are really communicating to folks that you're welcome in this space, even if you don't always feel welcome in other spaces. And that's something I've experienced in a lot of small places in Appalachia to be true. If there's a bookstore, queer folks are going to be there because that is like one space where it's sort of like, you're going to be okay. But I think just when I was thinking about a bookstore to talk about on this show, it just felt really important to highlight, I think, the work that Mandy's doing at the Newt and the role that bookstores play in small places.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's a great story about the power of your bookstore, Mandy. This must be very wonderful to hear Neema talk about the Newt in that way.
It is. Thank you, Neema. That's really flattering. And I don't know when I set out to do this that was even what I intended. It wasn't intentional that this is the space I'm gonna create. I just think it happened organically. And it seems to be that it happens in other bookstores, I guess. Yes, Neema and I had that conversation about what she was experiencing in other small bookstores in Appalachia. And I really just wanted a space for the talented writers of this region. There was no home bookstore for writers of Central Appalachia, so particularly Eastern Kentucky. So that was first and foremost, I wanted to create that community in Hazard.
On your website, you talk about the goals for the bookstore, and you say that one of the things you wanted to do was to provide a place where readers and writers could come together and share the magic that happens when you truly love a book. Now, I know that this is a small business, right? And you have to pay the rent and you have to pay your taxes and stuff. But there is still this element of magic in a bookstore, right? How someone discovers themselves, opens their eyes to a new way of thinking, to history or possibility in the future. There's just like, I don't know, we talk to so many bookstores, and it feels like what you all do really is magic and sorcery of the best possible kind. And I wonder if you can talk about what is it that you do in your store, do you think, that makes people feel so welcome and so special, and where they can find themselves?
I don't know. That's a good question. And I have wondered that because, from early on, when I saw this was going to work and I felt like it was getting some traction and the brand was getting some traction, and I have thought about opening another one because there's so many spaces in Eastern Kentucky that need them. And my mom would say, but you won't be there.
Yeah.
It won't be the same because you won't be there.
Yeah.
And so I had to really think about what that meant and what that was. And that's not going to stop me, just by the way, if I plan on opening another one. But
WCB can run the other one, Mandy.
Exactly. Yes, I have backups. But I think it was just engaging with everybody that came through the door. And it was more for a need to, I I was just picking everybody's brain to see what people in the area were reading, because there's a space to buy books here. And I thought, my space is small, so I have to, I have to make sure that I curate this space very carefully to turn over sales. So, I just engaged with everybody that came in, and people are willing to talk if you'll listen, especially when it comes to books. My cousin who hangs out in the store sometimes, she's like, it's really like you're a bartender.
Yeah.
Like, people just come in and they just, they tell you their whole life story, and you can tell a whole lot about a person by what they read also.
It's true.
I think that idea of hand selling, which I feel like in big city bookstores, hand selling is not a thing I have experienced ever. In Boston, no, not really. I feel like I go in and I get my books, but no one is like trying to talk to me about my books. But I feel like that culture of hand selling, you feel it at the Newt. When I was there for my signing, there was a young person who came in and they basically asked for like they wanted a syllabus effectively of like, if I'm going to read like 5 books by Appalachian writers, like which 5 should they read? And it became like a communal process of all of us debating like, well, let's add this one, but then we might have to take away this one. Right. It is, I think, it's like, it's a very communal experience of like shared love of reading and books that is in that space. I mean, one of the women who was there, it was an older woman and her daughter was coming to meet her from Lexington. They'd both read the book together, and she had 2 pages of handwritten notes that she'd taken on the book, right? And she wanted to talk to me about her notes and what she'd observed and the questions that she had. She was coming to the bookstore to be in that conversation. It wasn't just about the book, it was about the conversation around the book. I think that is a really special thing, and I think it's a small place thing more than a big place thing in a lot of ways. I think things go slow enough that you can have that conversation. The pace is just a little bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hadn't really thought about it until you mentioned it, but I would say 75% of people that come in, I'm hand selling for the most part.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's really interesting that you have an environment where people are eager to hear and listen to your expertise. Like that they acknowledge that that's a value that your store offers and that you offer. That's exciting because that's how you discover new books, right?
Yeah.
You just come in and buy the books on your list, Neema, then you're only going to buy the books on your list.
Right. No, totally. And I think the other thing that makes Mandy a really important person in this matrix is that she knows so many of the writers who she's hand selling. Yeah. So the book, like there is this personal relationship on both sides of the equation. It's the relationship with the customers in the store as readers, but it's also the relationship with the writers. So when she's selling a book by Carter Sickles or Silas House or Annette Klotzettle, like these are people who she has relationships with, which also changes the nature of the conversation. It's not a transaction in the traditional way. It's really like, here are all these writers I care about and I'm connected to, and I want to connect you to them. It's really relational in a way that I think is different.
Absolutely.
I just want to take a moment to say Carter was on our show, and we're going to put the link to our conversation below because that book is amazing. That's the prettiest star.
Yes.
That's such a good book.
Love Carter.
Okay. Speaking of another terrific book that everyone should be reading, Neema's book, Another Appalachia. Congratulations on your book. I want to share some of there's great feedback about it, and I want to share some of that. So I found a review that said that this book has just the right balance of reverence and honesty. The Southern Review of Books calls the collection revelatory, and says that you achieve a complicated and nearly imperceptible balancing act between nostalgia, admiration, and humor for a place so many, even those of us born there, struggle to describe. The book has also been described as bright and deeply empathetic, and you've been described as an important voice in Americans' ongoing racial reckoning. Congratulations.
Thanks. It's hearing all that in a row is kind of a different experience.
What is it? do you forget all the good stuff that's been said because just like your life is just like, life is busy and you kind of like put it away? Or is that what it is?
You get the oxytocin or dopamine spike when like the thing first comes out, and then I think you just forget and keep moving and are like, oh yeah, that was the thing that happened. So when it gets stacked together like that, it reminds you again that, oh, like this was a good thing.
It's really a wonderful book, and I so appreciated spending time in this store, in your stories. This is an essay collection, and I wondered if you could tell our audience a little bit about what you have created here.
Yeah, I mean, I think at its core, it's a love letter to Appalachia. It is me trying to make meaning of growing up as a very minoritized person I was, a small community of Indian folks in southern West Virginia. And there were really powerful moments that I had and wonderful things that happened during my grow up. And there were really hard things that happened. And all of it has continued to sort of shape me into the current moment that I'm in right now. So the book is sort of trying to grapple with that history and also think about how that history shapes who I am in the present day. But it ultimately, I think, is really a love letter, but like love that's like real love, which is like messy and complicated and hard, not love that is rosy. I don't know how to write that, and I don't think that's the book. It's not rosy, but it is deeply loving.
It is. I think that comes across. I mean, even when you're talking in these essays about painful experiences or difficult things people have said or done to you, there's still a lot of love for this place that formed you. And I was drawn to the way the book describes community as this sort of living, breathing entity. It's not just, it is the physical place where you grow up and where you spend time, but it's also something you carry inside of you.
Yeah.
And that really felt like something that, even because your books, you also have some of the essays take place here in Boston. And it felt like, yet your community in West Virginia was still so much a part of who you are now and the way you see the world and interact, right? You can't, like, kind of, you never leave home. It's always with you.
That's exactly right. And yeah. in a way, you also can't go back. Like, I think that's the thing, is home is only with you, because the place that I grew up it's not the same place anymore. But that space and that community and those people will always shape who I am.
Yes. And the way you view or talk about community in this book is similar to how a bookstore functions, right? In this sort of like place within a place where it's so welcoming and it's so much a part of who you are, and you can find yourself there and you can change and you can grow and you can carry it with you. I just saw such parallels between like the idea of a bookstore and also these stories that you were writing.
I think that's
a stretch.
No, not at all. And I think that was actually, for me, like what was so powerful about my trip to Appalachia in June. I went to 4 bookstores on that trip, 2 in Kentucky and 2 in West Virginia, all in pretty small places. And what was most powerful for me was like feeling that sensation of community that felt the closest that I've gotten to Pamela Circle, which is where I grew up. Like that the feeling was the same. This idea that like there's a space where you're held and you're seen, and like all of you can be there. It was I felt like my nerves were like outside my body a lot during that week when I was in those bookstores, because I just was also so aware that like that space didn't exist when I was a kid, right? For young queer people growing up in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't a visible space where you could go necessarily, or where you knew that you would be able to connect with people. And so the existence of these spaces just makes me it moves me a lot. And again, at the Newt, like there were teenagers there. There were parents who were bringing their teenage kids who were saying like, how, like asking me like, how did you navigate queerness as a teenager? And I'm like, well, you're already like 7,000 miles ahead of me, because you're here. Like you're at this bookstore, you're finding these books, you're finding these stories, you're finding your space. Like that's And there's a space where you can do that. It's pretty tremendous.
And they're asking the questions. So they're aware of their questions that need to be asked and should be asked.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, that's Mandy, what an environment you have there. That's so exciting to hear that you have this place where people can come and find the connection that they need. That's such a valuable asset to your community. One of the things that you have on your website, Mandy, is you write that Appalachia is a region rich in storytelling. What is it? I mean, it's a question for both of you, but what is it about Appalachia that creates this storytelling tradition, this expertise in making the past come alive and creating stories that people want to hear? What do you think? What is it? You smiled when I asked the question, Neema. Have you been asked that before? Was it not?
No, I thought about it a lot, especially living here now, right? I live in New England now for almost as long as I lived in Appalachia. So I sort of have this weird 20 years in one, 20 years in the other kind of experience. I think that there was not a lot to do where I grew up. Like, what you did was you went and sat on people's porches or in people's living rooms or in their yards, and you sat and you talked. That was the doing. In Boston, like, the doing is like you have to go somewhere, you have to go to a restaurant, go to a movie theater, go to a bar. Like, there's a lot of going as doing. But I think when what you're doing is slowing down and spending time together, and like it is the relationship that is the doing, storytelling is kind of at the core of that. Like that's how we're sharing with each other. That's how the conversations are grounded in story. I think that just I feel like that's just so much of how I grew up, was like listening to people tell stories. And I don't think I knew that that's what was happening, but I think it's what was happening is like people were telling stories all the time. I don't know, Mandy, what do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, I had the same experience. I think it was, and that was the doing, sitting around telling stories. And oftentimes it was, trying to one up each other on the storytelling too. So they got a little more grandiose every time something was told, like a fish tale or something. And I think it has been a form of entertainment. I feel like when you look at the history of like Jack Tales and that kind of thing, I mean, I think it has been a form of entertainment here. And I think there is this need, in recent years, or there's just been this need for us to tell our story, that we're telling our story. So I think that kind of breeds a lot of writers in the area, because you feel like that this narrative is being told that's not necessarily your experience or what you know to be true for Appalachia. So we all have this desire to tell our story.
Neema, in an interview, you said, I'm going to quote you. I can't write about my identity and experiences without also considering the ways in which place shaped who I am and how I live. I think that might be one of the hallmarks of Appalachian writing. Place is a character in our work as much as people are. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm really curious about like place as a character, places, because there is so much. For people who are not from Appalachia, there are a lot of stereotypes, and they're not complimentary. And that's unfortunate, because then you miss out on a rich heritage. And so I'm curious about, as a writer and as two people who are involved in the literary community representing this part of the country, how do you create place in a way that people can connect to it, that they can see it?
I mean, I think that in my book, like the first essay in my book is a drive. You take the drive that I took every day of my life, right, to get to my house. I think in a way I felt like I needed to ground people in the place, because I was like, I don't know how to tell you this story if you can't see it and feel it and know it the way I did. And so really situating people in the place of Crosslanes, West Virginia, felt like the most important thing I had to do. Crosslanes had to be the character. And then I could tell you the rest of the story once you had that, but I knew that if I didn't tell you, if I didn't really render it for you, you were going to fill it in with all of your stereotypes. Like, it was going to get filled in by what you've heard and seen on Netflix and on the New York Times bestseller list and in all these places where what's actually being said doesn't resonate. And I think that I didn't know when my understanding of the relationship between place and Appalachian writing has come as I've been writing. Like, I didn't start knowing that, but intuitively, I knew how important place was in the story. And then as I started to talk to more and more people, I was like, oh, this is actually a thing in all of our stories. It is a thing that if you read Breeze DJ Pancake, if you read Silas House, if you read Carter Sickles, if you read folks, like, place is so salient in the work that they're doing. And I think part of that is because people are trying to sort of lay it bare for readers from outside. But I also think part of it is because people can't not talk about place because they're so aware of how place is forming their relationships with one another and their relationship with their self.
Excellent. Mandy, are there, I mean, I know there are, but can you think of writers who write about Appalachia who are just like very skilled at place, like immediately come to mind? It's like, oh, this is a person who captures my community really well. Is Mandy? Oh, there you go.
That's tough. I think the one that probably resonated most with me is Robert Gibb.
Yep.
I think the place that he writes about and the community that I see and the characters that I see, those are the ones I most relate to. I think Silas writes about place really beautifully. But there was something about Dawn Jewell's character, and I mean, it's she was my age during the time when I was a teenager, and I think maybe that probably was a reason why that I recognized that place. As soon as I started reading, I was like, oh, I've been here. Like, this is where I grew up. And I think that's a part of Appalachian literature that I didn't even realize, Neema, like you were talking about. Like, I don't even know that I recognized it was place, because I could read the same story that maybe took place somewhere else, but the one that took place in Appalachia, because of the place that's involved in the story too, the setting of the story, would drive home, for me, more of what I was looking for. I could see myself in that, where that same story could take place somewhere else, and it would kind of miss with me, if that makes sense.
It does.
I think the thing that is pretty radical too about
me, go ahead.
Go for it. No, you go.
Well, that's the space that I feel like also when I knew that having the Appalachian literature section was important to me, because these are the books that you can't go get on the shelf at Walmart, which is really my only competition in town. I mean, I knew that these were the books that I wanted, because I wanted, especially kids. Like, I feel like when you can see yourself in a story, or see somebody that is from here that's a writer, I just think it changes everything for you. When you can see yourself, it opens doors that you don't know are possible, I think, as a kid especially.
Yeah. Robert came and read at the Young Writers Workshop in June, and there was something, like, I just was in that room and I was thinking about all these young people, hearing him read and hearing stories that they know in a voice that they know by a person from the same place that they're from. And when I was growing up, we didn't read Appalachian writers in school. Appalachian writing was not valued by my teachers. It wasn't something that we were given access to. I had a neighbor who used to sneak me books. And I remember reading this book called Crumb by Lee Maynard, who was from about an hour from where I'm from. And it was the first time I'd read a book where the dialogue in the book, I was like, oh, this sounds like home. This sounds like people who I know. And that was a book I read not in school, not at the encouragement of any of the educators in my life, right? And then you think about young people having access to books like Robert's, which are rooted in Appalachia. People talk the way people in Appalachia talk. They're talking about things people in Appalachia care about. How different is it for a young person to know that that is literature?
Yeah.
And to know that like those stories matter and are important and are centered. I think that experience is more significant than a lot of people realize.
I'm just, there we go. Getting Mandy back in. Okay, great. Thank you. So I want to make sure we get a link for Robert's book below in the comment. So Robert Gobb.
Gipe. G-I-P-E.
Great. Well,
I'm so sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll get that and we'll put it below so people can go check out his work. So Mandy, I know that we've been talking a lot about the bookstore and about sense of community. And I know that one way that your community comes together is in times of crisis. And that has been something that Eastern Kentucky has faced. Last month you had floods, and I know they were particularly devastating. Can you talk a little bit about how things are now and how you're doing, how your friends, your family?
Yeah, so I was actually at the Appalachian Writers Workshop when the flood happened on Wednesday night into Thursday morning. So I got to experience it with a whole group of writers, which was interesting. And you know, this area is prone to flooding, but we surely hadn't seen anything like this. I don't know ever. Normally it's a lot of localized flooding. You might have one community, and this was like a 5-6 county area was affected. You know, thousands of people at this point. Some completely, homeless, basically. I mean, they lost everything. Houses were moved off of foundations. I mean, it's unbelievable, the devastation. And I don't think you can really get a sense of what's happening unless you're here and you see it, you know, because you just can't. You have to be able to see the landscape and understand that entire valleys were filled with water, you know, places that had never seen water before. So I think now we're kind of in a phase where there was a lot of volunteer work early on in the first week or so. You know, there was a lot of rescues, making sure people were getting fed. And now we're moving into a space that's kind of tricky, I think, for disasters, where our society is so prone to just to the next that we will be in need for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, this goes past the first couple of weeks. You know, we came in, we brought a load of water, did our part, and left. You know, I think the people of Eastern Kentucky need help.
We've included some links below to. Oh, sorry, Mandy. I'm sorry, Mandy.
So, there are lots of different ways to get involved.
I'm sorry, I talked over you. There's a little delay on my end.
Well,
so we've been
certain. Yeah, the service is so spotty.
No worries. We appreciate you sticking with us. We've included some links below to some ways people can get involved and offer help. Is there a particular organization or organizations that you'd want to direct people to that have been particularly involved, useful right now, making a big difference? Red Cross. I don't know who actually is on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky is a pretty amazing organization that has been doing a lot of relief work. I think there's like another piece of the devastation. I think the flag is there's like the individual displacement, and then there's also this really intense cultural displacement that I think is also happening in parallel, which is in Eastern Kentucky. There are a lot of archives and a lot of cultural institutions that have been doing tremendous work to support and sustain Appalachian culture. Apple Shop is an incredible organization in Whitesburg, Kentucky that does a ton of media work has massive archives of narratives that have been recorded over generations. Hindman Settlement School, similarly, had a tremendous archive of Appalachian literature and is a site for a lot of cultural work. And so I think there's two kinds of work that happen now, right? There's the work of helping families get back on their feet, get back into housing. And then there's also this question of what does it look like to help cultural institutions recover from this kind of damage? And so Apple Shop and Hyman would be two other places I would flag as folks who've done such important work for so long and are really going to continue to try to keep doing that work, but don't always flag in the way people think about disaster. Like, I think people are more familiar with like thinking about the more traditional sort of like ways in which communities are affected, but these institutions do a ton of work that's so important.
Great, thank you for mentioning those. We'll put some links below so people can. Please.
I mean, they're essentially the keepers of our history.
That's right.
I mean, they're the ones that have allowed us to record our history and tell the story. So those are two devastating losses.
Yeah. That's a difficult blow for everyone involved. So I appreciate you highlighting it so our audience can research it more and understand what's going on and support in ways that they can be involved. It matters.
I just with Kimberly, I'd love to say, I think being in New England has been interesting during this because I've sort of watched it from afar, and I've really struggled with some of the narrative that people outside Appalachia have, where their response to seeing devastation and disaster is to be like, well, people there voted a certain way, so they deserve a certain outcome. And I just want to go on the record that some of the most politically radical people I know live in Eastern Kentucky.
Yeah.
And this idea that places are all red or all blue or all holy or all hell, like those ideas are just really false. And so I think if we want people to be treated with full humanity, that extends to every geography. And so I hope that folks extend that grace to people in Appalachia like they would to people anywhere else.
Yeah, important. Thank you for saying that. It really does speak to the polarization we have in our country, that in a time of crisis, people are like, well, I'm not going to support them because I don't like how they voted. Like, we're all human. We're all like, if it happened here in New England, we'd want help, right? So it feels so short-sighted to close the door on lending a hand and to dismiss someone's pain. So yeah, thank you for saying that. And I think the loss of history, like oral histories and stories, it's like, if we lose where we've come from, how can we ensure that the future doesn't repeat mistakes or that we don't grow, or I don't know, it just feels like so short-sighted. So thank you for saying that. Neema, I'm like fascinated that you're a middle school teacher. And as someone who may have a child in middle school. And I'm really curious about how being a teacher has impacted your writing. So spending so much time with young people and writing a book where you talk a lot about being a young person. And I'm wondering, how does your role as an educator influence your writing? Have your students read your book? And if so, what did they have to say?
I definitely don't think there would be a book if I hadn't been a teacher. I think that being a teacher taught me so much about how important mirrors are for young people, right? Rudine Sims Bishop is this amazing educator and thinker who talks about the idea that books can be mirrors, they can be windows, or they can be sliding doors. And I didn't have mirrors when I was growing up. I read X-Men comics and was like, oh, I think that might kind of be a mirror. I think they're trying to talk about something about race here, but I'm not sure, right? Like that, there were no mirrors. I was in my 30s before I got my first mirror in a book, and that was Mira Jacobs' book, Good Talk. That was the first time I read a book and was like, oh, you're doing that thing. I know what that means now. Yeah. And working with young people who are in the throes of identity formation, it just was so clear to me all the time when kids needed a mirror, when they needed to be able to look at something outside themselves and see themselves reflected and have someone else say, no, you're okay.
Yeah.
Like, you're okay. It's going to be okay. Like, you're not by yourself. And so I think a lot of writing the book for me was for that purpose. It was to hold up a mirror. So if you're a queer kid in Appalachia or you're a brown kid anywhere, like, there's a book that you can read that maybe has some of the same questions that you do. And I feel like I couldn't have gotten to that place without being a teacher. I also think it impacts the style of the way that I write. I'm not I'm not gonna leave anything to interpretation. Like, I'm just gonna tell it to you plain and straight, and clearly. It's not gonna be in footnotes, and it's not gonna be something that you have to be wondering about for a long time. I think clarity is a big part of being a teacher, and so that comes through in the book as well.
Excellent. So we talked a little bit earlier about a couple Appalachian writers that you wanted to recommend, but I know our audience loves to get book recommendations from our guest author and bookseller, and obviously we want everyone to go read your book, Neema, and we're putting the link repeatedly below in the broadcast. So please go click on the link and go buy the book from Mandy's bookstore. Are there other writers that you would say, if someone says, I want to read a book or two about Appalachia, where do I start? In addition to Neema's book, what do you recommend? Where would you say start with this person? You mentioned Robert before, and we have links to his books and his website below. Is there someone else that you would recommend start with this?
Mandy, you want to go first? I think we might have lost Mandy a little bit. I can go.
I think she's frozen.
Yeah. Anne Pancake is an amazing West Virginia writer. Strange as This Weather May Seem is a beautiful book. I would highly recommend that as a great place to start for West Virginia writers. Robert Gipe is definitely always an important read in Eastern Kentucky. I think Mandy's back with us. I don't know if she has other recs she'd want to share. Oh.
Yeah, I missed the whole conversation. Who have you recommended so far? Anne Pancake, Robert Gipe.
And Rob, yeah, that's it. Go. You got it. Other people?
Okay. I mean, for me, I think it's important that the voices that haven't typically been heard or associated with Appalachia. I mean, that's why I think Neema's book is so important. I think Annette Clapsaddle's book, Even As We Breathe, an Indigenous voice, very important to Appalachia, one that's not a story that's not been told, voices that haven't been heard. Carter Sickles, Evening Hour and Prettiest Star both. Silas House has kind of paved the way, I think, for a lot of Eastern Kentucky writers. I mean, it was a big when I read Clay's Quilt for the first time, that was life-changing for me, honestly, because it was present day Appalachia, which a lot of people weren't writing at that time, or I didn't get my hands on it. And Silas actually has a new book coming out at the end of September, Larkus Ending. Goodness. There are so many, and I hate being put on the spot like this.
Those are great recommendations. Thank you.
I've got a couple more. I can. Crystal Wilkinson.
There's a lot of them.
Kristen Wilkinson's book, Birds of
I'm
Opulence.
going to catch it if I don't.
I think you froze on us, Mandy. So Neema, you were saying Crystal Wilkinson?
Yep. Yeah, her book, two books, a poetry collection, Perfect Black, and her book of short stories, Birds of Opulence, are both excellent. Okay. And there's also a great poet whose name is Frank X. Walker. His poetry collection, Appalachia, is really incredible as we think about sort of like highlighting Appalachian identities that don't always get sort of surfaced in the mainstream narrative.
Great. Thank you for those recommendations. We'll put links below. So Neema, this very interesting thing is you are the third author we have had on the show this year who was published by West Virginia University Press. And I mean, I imagine they have a great PR team, but it's not like we're getting pitched all the time. It's, it's kind of, you all came to us in different ways. We had Disha Filia on with her amazing book, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. We had Kate McIntyre on with her beautiful book, Mad Prairie. And now we have you on with your amazing book. And I'm just struck by how, first of all, like wonderful all of these books were, how very different they all are, how terrific they are. And I'm just curious about what's the experience of being published by a small press, and how is that, like, because the quality of the work is really exceptional. And I'm wondering what the environment is like. And as a writer, were you supported? Can you say about that experience?
Yeah, I think everybody should try to publish their books with West Virginia University Press. It is an incredible, incredible press. It just centers like all the values in publishing that I think are often not centered in the Big Five. Just really thinking about, how do you center people's humanity in this work? How do you really focus on quality and on support as like the things that you're trying to do, instead of trying to publish 100 books at a time? Like, what does it look like to really focus on publishing 7, but making them as good as you can possibly get them to be? There are just a lot of things about the way the press operates that really resonate for me in terms of how I, as a writer, think about writing, and how, as a reader, want to read. I also think because it's a small press, they can take different kinds of risks. I tried the mainstream, like, query, look for an agent way, and people were really nice, but they were like, we don't know how to sell this book. Indian and queer from Appalachia, like, no one's going to read that. Sorry, no one's going to read your book, right? And so to have West Virginia say, oh no, we know exactly how to sell this book, is just a different kind of thing. They know their audience, they know their markets, they know their bookstores, like they know how to sell my book. And so I just feel like it has been a really, really wonderful publishing experience, and really kind of proven to me that, like, finding the right place for your book is the most important thing, and finding the place where the people who have your book care about it as much as you do and understand it deeply, and know and have confidence in their ability to sell it is really an important thing. And I just think, everything about this book, the cover of the book,
Great.
Right? But it's also like an off-center fuzzy picture from the 1980s. I cannot imagine a Big Five publisher publishing a book with that photograph. In some ways, it's not fancy. It's not, but I sent it to the designer as like inspiration, and then the designer was like, no, that's the cover. And my editor was like, we're going to lead with your identity. Like, we're not going to leave it so that someone doesn't understand what this is about from the outset. That picture is a very classic West Virginia picture. Every West Virginia family has a picture of Babcock Mill. It's just that most of those families are not Indian, right? And so what does it look like to put that on the cover and just say, we're leading with this? I think even those choices to me felt very much about the fact that I went with this small press or university press.
Excellent. Well, we have come to the end of our time, and I still have like 40 other questions. So I really appreciate the two of you being with us today. But Mandy, the last question always goes to the bookseller. So here you go. Please finish this sentence for us. Running a successful bookstore is part hard work, part luck, and part what else?
Foolishness sometimes.
Okay, I'll let you first.
Hard work, luck, and I think just passion. I just love it, and I think that comes through in what I do, in what I choose to sell, in the community that I create, in the relationships that I have with my customers. I think they can tell that it's genuine, that I'm passionate about it, and I'm not here to get rich. I can tell you that. But that I love it as much as they do. And I'm just, I just really want to create the space. I enjoy being there and love it. And I hope they do too.
And they do. You don't need to be in there 2 minutes before you know that.
Oh, it sounds like a very special place. So thank you for sharing Red Spotted Newt with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I wish I would have got to participate in half of the conversation. The internet was horrible.
Well, we'll do it next time for Neema's next book. How about that?
Yes.
Sounds good.
No pressure, Neema. Thank you, both of you. And thank you for our audience for being with us today. If you liked today's show, and we hope that you did, please subscribe to A Mighty Blazes page on Facebook to get notified about all of our events. Or if you're not a Facebook person, hop over to our website, amightyblaze.com, to sign up for a newsletter. It goes out once a week and gives you the rundown of all of our shows. We'll be back here next week for our 109th episode with George Dawes Green. And we hope that you'll join us then. So until then, be well and keep reading. Thanks, everyone.